Hey guys, it's Izzy here, and today I am going to be showing you all my stats for all of the books that I read in 2019. Roses, their debut album, I think it's one of the best-selling albums of all time. We're going to be looking at Goodreads first and just talking about like what my reading goal was in 2019, and then of course we're going to talk about my goals for 2020 as well. So I'm trying to find out how you get to the page where it shows you how many pages you read. Okay, 2019 year in books. So here we go. And this is on the Goodreads app. You can add me on there. It's just my name, Elizabeth Raines, and it's spelled Raines. So here we go. So my year 2019 in books. So this is my journey in books for 2019. I read 22,144 pages across 62 books. So my shortest book was actually a book that I showed in a video, in an ASMR video. That is The Little Penguin by A.J. Wood, and it was only 24 pages long. And my longest book was 1,232 pages, and that was Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. So my average length of the books that I read was 357 pages, which I feel like that is a pretty good average. So the most popular book that I read was Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling, and that was 6 million people have read that book. My least popular only had 96 people also read it, and that was The War of the Roses, or The Wars of the Roses by Elizabeth Hallam. So my average rating for 2019 was a 3.9 star. 3 stars is an average for me, so 3.9, I'm not surprised by that. So the highest rated on Goodreads was The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna, which has a 4.64 average star review. So my first review of the year was To All We Ever Wanted by Emily Giffin. And then we just go through all the books that I read. So my last review was My Life with Death with David Ellefson and Joel McKeever, I'm not sure. So I read 62 books out of 50. My goal was 50 books. So that was 124%. So my goal for this coming year will be 63 books, which is just one up from last year of how many books that I read last year. So going into the second half in this video, I'm going to tell you all the books I read, the dates I read them, the page number, the rate, the genre, the format, and then which ones were my favorite. So I make these charts every year and then print it out on New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, whenever. So the first book that I finished in 2019 was All We Ever Wanted by Emily Giffin. That was 400 pages, and I read it from January 1st to January 7th, and it was a 3 out of 5 stars. The genres are fiction, chick lit, and contemporary, and I read a hardback edition of that book. So our next book was Paris by Julian Green, which was only 153 pages, and I read that from January 8th to January 9th. And that was a 3 out of 5 stars. So the genres are the popular shelves on Goodreads. So the genres were French, memoir, classics, and literature, and that was a paperback. So now going into one of my favorite books from 2019, that is The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna, which was 564 pages. So I read that from January 9th to January 18th, and it was obviously a 5 out of 5 star. So its genres are historical fiction, World War II, and war. And I read the paperback and the audiobook for. Our next one is a lengthy one, and that is A Dance with Dragons by George R.R. Martin, and that was 1,125 pages. So I started that book on November 30th of 2018, but didn't finish it till January 23rd of 2019. So that was a 4 out of 5 star, and that was fantasy, fiction, and epic fantasy. So I did the paperback and ebook version of that. So our next one is another favorite of mine, and that is The Forgotten Legion by Ben Kane. So that was 525 pages. So that I read from January 19th to January 28th, and that was again a 5 out of 5 stars, and that is a historical fiction, and I read the paperback edition. It was a nice floppy paperback. So now we are getting into February. The first book I read in February was The Female of the Species by Mindy McGinnis, which was 352 pages long. And that I read from February 1st to February 8th, and it was a 3 out of 5 stars. Unpopular opinion. So it was a young adult contemporary mystery, fiction, and thriller, and I read the paperback edition. Our next book is our first graphic novel of 2019, and that is Fortress Vader by Charles Soule and Giuseppe Camuncoli, maybe wrong. So that was 168 pages, and I read that on Valentine's Day, and this is when I was still giving graphic novels a star rating, which I do not do anymore, but I did give it a 5 out of 5 star. If it is a Vader comic, it is going to be a 5 out of 5 star. So that was Star Wars, comics, graphic novels, science fiction, and Marvel, and that was a paperback. So our next one is controversial now, and that is Johnson's Life of London by Boris Johnson, which was 400 pages, and I read that from February 10th to February 19th, and it was a 4 out of 5 star. It's history, nonfiction, and travel, and I read the paperback edition. So we are going to another graphic novel, which is another Star Wars one, and that is Prisoner of Bogan by John Ostrander, which was 130 pages. I read it on February 20th, and I did not give it a star rating. And its genres are Star Wars, comics, graphic novels, and science fiction, and it was a paperback. So Girls of Paper and Fire is the next book I read, and that is by Natasha Nguyen, and it was 400 pages, and it took me 5 days to read, from the 22nd of February to the 27th. And that was a 4 out of 5 stars. So it's a fantasy, young adult, and LGBT, and I read the hardback and audiobook for that. So then we have Ireland by Frank Delaney, and this was 576 pages, and it was our first book of March, which I started on the 4th of March, and I read it to the 11th of March, and that was a 4 out of 5 stars. Its genres are historical fiction, Ireland, and Irish literature, and I did the paperback and audiobook. Highly recommend the audiobook for that book. So then we have another one of my favorites, and I think it is a lot of people's favorite book of the year, and that is Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. It was 337 pages, and it only took me 2 days to read, which was March 12th through the 14th, and that was a 5 out of 5 star. And these genres are historical fiction and adult, and I read the hardback version. So we have A Game of Thrones Volume 4, which is the graphic novel version of the series, which is by Daniel Abram and George R.R. Martin. It was 183 pages and took me 3 days to read, from March 14th to the 17th. I did not give it a star rating. And it's graphic novels, fantasy, and comics, and it was a hardback. Now to one of my least favorite books of the year. We have like 2 least favorites. So, in back to back. So this is The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden, which is 312 pages. It took me forever to get through, from March 19th to the 27th. It was a 3 out of 5. Its genres are fantasy, historical fiction, young adult, and fairy tales, and it was a paperback. Our next one is The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, which was 291 pages, and I read that from March 27th to the 30th, and that was another 3 out of 5, historical fiction, mythology, fantasy, and retelling, and that was a hardback from Book of the Month. So then we have a graphic novel, which is Saga, Volume 1 by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples, and that is 176 pages. I read that on March 31st, 2019. It did not get a star review, but it's a 5 star. And so that is a graphic novel, comics, fantasy, and science fiction, and I read the paperback for it. So now we have another favorite that actually got a 4 out of 5 star, and that is The Clockmaker's Daughter by Kate Morton, and that was 482 pages. The first book I read in April, starting on April Fool's Day, April 1st, and I read till April the 7th, so it was a 4 out of 5, historical fiction and fantasy, and a hardback edition of the book. So another least favorite, and that is Thorn in My Heart by Liz Curtis Higgs, which was 475 pages, and I read from April 8th to April 14th. It was a 2 out of 5 star, and the genres are Christian fiction, historical fiction, romance, and adult fiction, and that was a paperback. So our next book is the least popular book that I read in 2019, and that was The Wars of the Roses by Elizabeth Hallam, which was 307 pages, and I read from April 15th to April 22nd, and that was a 4 out of 5 star. Its genres are history, nonfiction, war, British literature, and medieval, and it was a hardback. And that is our first page of... Alright, let's go to page 2 now. Our first book is an autobiography, and that is Slash by Slash with Anthony Bozza, and it was 453 pages, and I read that from April 22nd to April 30th, and it was a 4 out of 5 star. So this was a music, nonfiction, autobiography, and memoir, and it was a paperback. So I read Star Wars Darth Maul, Son of Dathomir by Jeremy Barlow and Juan Figueroa, and that was 136 pages, and I read that on May 4th, 2019 for May the 4th be with you, and I did not give a star rating to that. So this was a Star Wars graphic novels, comics, and science fiction, and was a paperback. So now we are going to, I think, the first classic I read of the year, and it was one of my favorites, and that is Les Mis by Victor Hugo, which was 1,200 pages. I read that from the 1st of May to the 10th of May, and it was a 5 out of 5. It's a classic fiction, historical fiction, and literature, and I did the hardback and audiobook for it. So then we have Runaways, Volume 1, Pride and Joy by Brian K. Vaughan and Adrienne Alfona, which was 152 pages. I read on May 11th, 2019. Did not give a star rating. It's a comic graphic novel, young adult, superheroes, Marvel, and fantasy, and it is a paperback. So keeping with the theme of graphic novels, I read Star Wars Han Solo by Marjorie M. Liu and Oliver Coipel, which was 120 pages, and I read that on the 18th of May. Did not give a star rating, so it is Star Wars comics, graphic novels, and science fiction, and was a paperback. So the next book was a book club, Books with Friends, and that is Descendants of the Crane by Joan He, and that was 401 pages, and it took me 10 days to read because I was on vacation, and that was from May the 12th to the 22nd, and it was a 3 out of 5 star book. So it was a fantasy, young adult, and fiction, and I read a hardback version. So our next one was a graphic novel of a classic, and that is about Beowulf by Gareth Hines and A.J. Church, which was 120 pages. I read on the 25th of May, did not give a star rating. It was a classic graphic novels, fantasy, and fiction, and a paperback. Going back to a rock star book, we have 18 and Life on Skid Row by Sebastian Bach. He wrote it all himself, and it's 425 pages, and I read that from May 23rd to the 27th. It was a 4 out of 5 star. Music, nonfiction, biography, memoir, and autobiography, and I did the hardback and audiobook, and it was one of my favorite books of 2019. So then we have another nonfiction, and that is Orange is the New Black by Piper Kerman, which was 295 pages. I read this book from the 28th of May to the 31st. I read it by the pool for the most part, and it was a 3 out of 5 star nonfiction, memoir, and biography, and it was a paperback and audiobook. So going to DC Comics, I read Batman Volume 1, I Am Gotham by Tom King, Scott Snyder, and Michael Janin, and that was 192 pages. I read it on the 1st of June, first day of hurricane season, and that did not get a star rating. It is a comic graphic novel, Batman, DC Comics, and superheroes, and it was a paperback. Our next book is a huge book that took me 6 months to read, and that is It by Stephen King, which was 1,153 pages, and I read that from January 29th to June 9th of 2019. It was a 3 out of 5 star. It's horror, fiction, and thriller. I did the paperback, audiobook, and ebook because it took me forever to get through. So then I read Da Vinci's Tiger by L.M. Eliot, which was 275 pages. I read from June 3rd to June the 11th. It was a 3 out of 5. a historical fiction, young adult, and romance, and I read the hardback. Then we have Star Wars The Prequel Trilogy, a graphic novel by Alessandro Ferrari, I don't know, which was 208 pages long and took me 2 days to read from the 12th of June to the 14th. I did not give it a star rating, but it was really good. It's a Star Wars graphic novels, comics, and science fiction, and it was a hardback. Then we have another graphic novel, and that is Stranger Things Volume 1, The Other Side. And this is Jody Hauser, Stefano Martino, and Keith Champagne. It was 96 pages. I read on the 22nd of June. I did not give it a star rating. It is a graphic novel, comic, horror, and science fiction, and I read the hardback. Then I read I skipped one. It's Sky Painted Gold by Laura Wood, which was 385 pages. I started it on June 17th and finished it up on the 26th of June. So it's a 3 out of 5 star, a historical fiction, young adult, and romance, and I read the paperback. Then we have Meddling Kids by Edgar Quintero, which was 326 pages long. I read from the 27th of June to the 3rd of July. This is when I was starting to carry over books from TBRs, and that is something I'm still doing today, which is not good. So that was a 4 out of 5. It was a horror, mystery fiction, fantasy, paranormal, adult, supernatural, and LGBT, and I did the paperback and the audiobook for. Our next book is the first official romance novel, and that is The Perfect Date by Evelyn Lolazda and Holly Lawrence. It was 275 pages, and I started that book on July 4th and ended on July 12th, and it was a 3 out of 5, a romance, contemporary, sports, chick lit, fiction, adult, sports romance, and baseball, and that was a paperback, and that is page 2 of it. Okay, starting page 3, I read The Ice Dragon by George R.R. Martin and Luis Arroyo, and that was 120 pages, and I read on the 13th of July. Why did I read that in the middle of summer? Who knows? And it was a 5 out of 5, fantasy, dragons, children's, fiction, young adult, short story, middle grade, high fantasy, adventure, and novella, and it was a hardback. So this is the only children's book that I gave a rating, just because it was listed as young adult as well. So I'm not sure how to go about with that. So then we had The Last Magician, which I read in a book club, and that is by Lisa Maxwell. Exactly 500 pages. Took me 5 days from the 15th to the 20th of July. It was a 5 out of 5, a fantasy, young adult, time travel, historical fiction, and magic, and I read the hardback and audiobook for it. Then we have Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, which was the most popular book out of this list, and that is by J.K. Rowling, 310 pages. I read that from the 1st of July to the 21st. It was a 5 out of 5, fantasy, young adult, and fiction, and I did the paperback and ebook for it. So our next one is The Girls by Emma Cline, which was 355 pages. It took me 4 days from the 22nd to the 26th of July. It was a 4 out of 5, fiction and historical fiction, and a paperback. So back to graphic novels with Saga Volume 2 by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples, and that was 160 pages, and I read on the 27th of July. I did not give it a star rating. It is a graphic novel, comic, fantasy, science fiction, and just plain fiction, and I did the paperback. So the next book I started on my birthday, and that is A Different Kind of Fire by Stu-Ann Schaefer. It was 391 pages, so I started on July 29th and ended on August the 10th. And this was a 3 out of 5, and its genres are historical fiction and LGBT, and I wrote the paperback. So then we have Batman Volume 2, I Am Suicide by Tom King, Michael Shannon, and Mitch Gerrits. It was 168 pages. I read on the 17th of August. I did not give a star rating. It's a comic, graphic novel, Batman, and DC Comics, and I read the paperback. Then we have Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, which was 620 pages. It is a long one, trust me. And that was from the August the 11th to the 21st. 3 out of 5 stars, classics, fiction, and romance. And I did the hardback, paperback, and audiobook. So then we have a magical realism one that I read once again, and I think it was with Books with Friends. and that is The Strange and Beautiful Sorrows of Ava Lavender by Leslie Walton, and that was 301 pages. I read from August 22nd to September the 4th. It was a 5 out of 5 stars. It's fantasy, young adult, magical realism, and I lost my place, fiction, and romance in a paperback, and it was one of my favorites. So then we have Check Please, Book 1, #Hockey by Nagazi Aksu. That was 288 pages. I read it on the 14th of September. Did not give a star rating. It is a graphic novel, LGBT, young adult, comic, and sports. And that is a paperback. So the next book is another one of my least favorites from the year. And that is, oh, I just got hair in my mouth. But that is Secret for a Nightingale by Victoria Holt, which was 371 pages. It took me 12 days to read from the 5th of September to the 17th. I gave it a 2 out of 5 stars, and that is a romance, gothic, historical fiction, and fantasy, and I read the hardback version. So going to Harry Potter now. I read Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets by J.K. Rowling. It was 341 pages, and I started on August 10th and ended on September 22nd of 2019, and that was a 5 out of 5. Fantasy, young adult, fiction, and magic, and I did the paperback and ebook. So our next book is another one of my favorites. It came from Book of the Month, and that is The Summer of '69 by Ellen Hilderbrand. It was 418 pages. I started on the 18th of September and ended on the 25th of this month. So then that was a 5 out of 5 star, a historical fiction, and a hardback. So then we had The Book Thief, which I think everybody needs to read with what is happening in our world right now. That is by Marcus Zuzak, and it is 552 pages. I started this book on the 26th of September and ended on the 4th of October, so we're in October now. That was a 4 out of 5. It's historical fiction and young adult, and I did the hardback and the audiobook for it. Then we have Pumpkin Heads by Rainbow Rowell, I don't know how to say her last name, and Faith Erin Hicks. It was a 209 pages. I read that on the 12th of October, perfect fall read. Did not give it a star rating. It is a graphic novel, young adult, contemporary, and romance, and it is a hardback. So our next book is a children's book, which again, with everything happening in the world, I recommend reading, and that is Faithful Elephants, A True Story of Animals, People, and War by Yukio Tsuchiya and Ted Lewin, and that was 32 pages, and I read it on the 21st of October. I did not give it a star rating. It is a picture book, historical fiction, animals, war, and children's, and that was a paperback. So our last book on this page is Wicked Saints by Emily A. Duncan. It was 381 pages. I read from the 7th of October to the 24th of October, and it was a 4 out of 5 stars. Fantasy, young adult, and hardback. Now let's get to the final. Okay, so our final page starts out with Sadie by Courtney Summers, which was 308 pages, and I read that from the 25th of October to the 1st of November, and it was a 4 out of 5, a young adult, mystery, contemporary, and fiction, and I did the audiobook and the hardback for it. So our next one is a fantasy novel, and that is The Kiss of Deception by Mary E. Pearson, which is 486 pages. I read that from November 4th to November 8th. It was a 4 out of 5 star, and it was a fantasy, young adult, and romance, and a paperback. Then I read Avatar, The Last Airbender, The Lost Adventures by Brian Konietzko, Michael Dante DiMartino, and Aaron Atches, which was 240 pages. I read that on the 9th of November. Did not give it a star rating. It is a comic graphic novel, fantasy, manga, fiction, young adult, adventure, short stories, and children's, and that is a paperback. So then I read The Legend of the Indian Paintbrush by Tommy DiPaolo, which was 37 pages. I read on 11/11, November 11th, 2019. It did not get a star rating, and Fred is pushing his whole body against a tripod. That was a picture book, children's, art, fiction, cultural, folklore, historical fiction, folktales, nature, and Native American, and it was a hardback. So then we have My Life with Death, Discovering Meaning in a Life of Rock and Roll by David Ellefson and Joel McIver, and that was 256 pages. I started that book on 11/11/2019 and then ended on 11/14/2019, and that was a 4 out of 5. It was music, biography, nonfiction, autobiography, and memoir, and that is a paperback. Then I read my favorite Harry Potter book, and that is Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban by J.K. Rowling. It was 435 pages, and I started that book on October the 5th and ended on November the 24th, and that was a 5 out of 5 fantasy, young adult, and fiction, and I did the paperback and ebook. Now, my last favorite book of the year was The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. It was also one of my most anticipated books of the year. It was 804 pages. I started it on the 15th of November and it ended on the 2nd of December. And it was a 5 out of 5, a fantasy, fiction, adult, and dragons, and I read the hardback edition. So then we have Annihilation by Drew Carbonson, which was 286 pages. I read that from December the 3rd to December the 12th. It was a 3 out of 5 stars, and it's Star Wars, science fiction, fantasy, and plain fiction, and that was a hardback. Then the last book that I read in the year was The Little Penguin by A.J. Wood and Stephanie Bowie, and it was 24 pages, and I read that on Christmas Eve of 2019, December 24th. I did not give it a star rating. It was a picture book, animals, children's, and fiction, and a paperback. And those are all my book stats from 2019. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and as always, comment, rate, and subscribe, and tell me down below in the comments how many books you finished in 2019. Bye guys!